should ask you to move forward, but I'm not going to do that because you know what? I am the person who likes to hang out at the back too. So you can stay at the back, but just reassure me because we just had lunch, right? Well, I forgot to eat, but the rest of you, I hope, had lunch, right? Is everyone awake? Yeah? Okay, this is one of my favorite conferences, so I'm really excited to give a general session here today. And I'm really happy that so many of you made it back after lunch and didn't just stay drinking or doing whatever it is that people do at lunchtime. So there was an article that I read last September, and it really profoundly affected my thinking. Yeah, it was by Sarah Tavel, and it was called "Times Have Changed: Going After Dollars versus Minutes." And she breaks products down into minutes, which I think of as attention as a metric, and dollars, which are things that people actually pay for. And she compares these two periods, noting that in the earlier one, 2008 to 2012, it was mostly minutes raising Series A funding. And in the later one, 2012 to 2015, it was a balance between minutes and dollars. So she writes from a VC perspective, but from an engineer and from a design perspective, like these things are also entirely different problems, right? And it reminded me of a conversation that I had with one of my friends a long time ago because she was thinking about going to work at Zynga. Do you remember Zynga? Yeah, I told you it was a long time ago. Anyway, our conversation was basically like how we would feel, whether we could actually do a job where what we were building was in effect a form of digital crack. So addictive games, right? Obviously, when I use the word digital crack, you know that I mean addictive games, right? But what this article did was it really expanded my view of what digital crack is and how many jobs in tech involve building it, right? So not just games, like these have really never appealed to me as a thing to build, but any kind of social media. A long time ago, I worked on Google+, and really perhaps the problem there was that instead of building digital crack, we were building a kind of digital multivitamin. So digital crack is about, the thrill of unpredictable reward, right? It's about creating a place where hours pass. On mobile, our attention spans are shorter, so we've kind of settled for minutes pass, right? But it's about pulling people back in with notifications. And it's about this careful balance between sucking people in, but not being too annoying, because then you'll drive them away. So digital crack is obviously a pejorative phrase, right? But digital crack is not inherently bad, right? Maybe I just have to believe this because I really love Twitter as much as the next person. But my current digital crack is actually Duolingo. Has anyone tried Duolingo? Has anyone got super addicted to Duolingo? Yeah, and you know what? It really messes with my self-esteem too. Like the other day, it told me I was 6% fluent in Spanish. I live in a Spanish-speaking country, and that day I had explained the Brexit in Spanish. I'm pretty sure that means that I'm more than 6% fluent in Spanish. Just use words like destruido and loco a lot, But anyway. So, I realized that I do not want to build digital crack. And I think I've always known this because I reflected back over the kind of things I worked on in my career. I built most of the first generation presentations experience on iOS. I ran a team that built a location-based B2B app. And most recently, I was actually working on carpooling, which failed. I'll talk about that later. But anyway, my passion project for a long time has been this image processing app, right? And no processing, not sharing. There's no platform. It doesn't really do anything other than make a nice image. It's like a tool. And so aside from that brief lapse in judgment when I went to work on Google+, I've really chosen to build things that I hope will help humans achieve things. And I can think of that as tools rather than experiences, right? It's really hard because in this industry, we really laud the digital crack. You all notice this? Attention is the foundation of the business model. And, aside from this analysis that was really, mind-opening to me, we have the impression that this is what VCs value, right? Because it's what we're talking about. Right now, when everyone keeps talking about Pokemon Go, I've not played this game. I don't really understand what happens, but I understood that somebody got mugged in the city where I live whilst they were playing with it. I don't know, maybe they deserved it. Probably not, nobody deserves to be mugged. But, but the second list was balanced in this kind of analysis from this VC, but I had heard of much more of the minutes apps than I'd heard of the dollars apps. But if we're not building digital crack, if our metric is not minutes spent, if it's actual human effectiveness, then what matters? What are we even doing? I was supposed to show this slide earlier. Let's see what else is here. Okay, there we go. So one thing I think we're trying to do is make complex processes simple. I have some examples. So this is just like a very abstract statement. I could mean anything here. So this is my passion project, and it's called Show and Hide. If you were here last year, I gave like a talk where I talked about how I got like 90% test coverage by being, you know, a very intense person, really. So like I said, it's an image processing app. But what does that mean versus something like Instagram, which is an image filtering app and a platform for sharing images, right? So a process means that we analyze the image and we change it based on the result of that process. So that's what Show and Hide does. It analyzes the image and it makes two partially colored images based on that. The first one shows the dominant color and the second one hides it. And so the idea is that it creates these like postcard images. Like if any of you have seen the postcards from London where the bus is red and everything else is black and white. So the idea is you can create images like that, but without actual artistic talent, which is good because I have no artistic talent. But you know, an image is just an array of colors, you know, which we might think about as a grid of numbers. And a filter is just another grid of numbers. And so to apply a filter, all we need is a little matrix multiplication. Not only is this a solved problem, it's one that's often done for us by the platform. But processing an image is not a solved problem, right? And it's vastly different depending on what kind of process we're trying to create. So my first functional go at this on iOS, it took about 10 seconds to run, and it made one image on a very scaled down version of that, right? But the version that I shipped, you see these sliders along the bottom. As you drag them, both images, which are nearly full size, update in real time. So on a practical level, what did I do? Well, I optimized the hell out of it and I wrote it in C. You know, sometimes people ask me what I did after I left Google, and I'm like, I wrote an algorithm and then I optimized it for space and time. Never did that when I worked there. But on a user experience level, what did I do? Well, I made the distinction between a process and a filter invisible. It is a process, but it feels like a filter, which is what users are used to and is what they expect. When I think about location, I think about Harry Potter and the Marauder's map. Has everyone here read Harry Potter? Okay. Has anybody missed the last 20 years and doesn't know who Harry Potter is? Okay, cool. So Harry's invisible, but he still shows up on the map, right? And this is often when he's being most effective. You know, he, or pretty often Hermione, because we all know that she does most of the work, right, are doing stuff that they can only do when they're invisible. And it's often clear as developers how location will really help us, but if we're not careful, we become too visible. You know, either by draining the battery or just by being super annoying. So I worked on this B2B app that was called Coordinate, and it was an app for tracking your mobile workforce. So they would have jobs and you could send them to nearby jobs. Our product manager told me it was like Latitude for business. I used to call it Stalk Your Mobile Workforce, and this is why I don't work in marketing. So we needed to do continual background location updates with varying levels of accuracy. And on high accuracy, we needed to have at least 8 hours of battery life and 15 meter 5-minute data. And we came in to do this on iOS, and it had already been done on Android, and so people didn't really understand how different it was. But the iOS location API, does anybody else know more than they should about the iOS location API? We can have some group therapy later. The iOS location API just wasn't designed to work that way, right? So when we turned it on to that level of accuracy, the battery just burnt down in an hour, especially if you were, say, riding a motorbike on the highway. We weren't exactly invisible there. So we figured out thresholds for turning the GPS on and off, and we tried to be smart about when we would send a location and when we wouldn't. We cached locations, and eventually when caching wasn't enough, if say you were wandering around an island with very poor cell phone service, taking pictures of adorable koalas, we implemented offline. And finally we got to about 12 hours of battery life on high, and for low accuracy, our battery usage was barely noticeable. We were actually doing better than the Android app. We had become invisible. This is my friend Dan. He's taking selfies with an owl in Tokyo. I gave this talk in Tokyo earlier this year, so I went back to that same cafe and took, in my opinion, better selfies of me with an owl, or at least more selfies of me with the owl. Like 3 hours, okay, maybe 5 hours. I really like owls, okay? So Dan made this game called Robot Turtles with his kids. It was actually the most backed board game in Kickstarter history. And as part of this, he acquired a $10,000 laser CNC machine that had to be delivered on a forklift truck. Here it is with some children for scale. And then on the right, you can see the different pieces and also a key for what they do. So Dan's now CEO of this startup called Glowforge. They make a desktop laser cutter, and they call it a 3D laser printer. And it's pretty amazing. So you can this pre-sale right now, and it's shipping, I think, towards the end of the year. So full disclosure, I'm an advisor, and one of the main benefits of that is that when I go to Seattle, they let me play with it, which is very exciting until that one time when I broke it. And so here's some stuff I made on it. So it's really cool because you see the bed and then you move your design over it and then you just press go and then it just prints. So first, because I'm such a programmer, I made a hello world. I printed out a logo for my then boss. More ambitiously, some pieces for a technically speaking keychain, which is a newsletter I co-run. And the necklace, I think, is one of my most treasured possessions because it's the show and highlight logo and it's engraved and it's cut away. So I also made this thing. I call this an abstrophe. Can anybody guess where the word abstrophe comes from? No? It's like I make up words that don't make sense. Abstrophe, abstract selfie. So it's a picture of my shadow that I took in Venice. I was wearing a beautiful fluffy hat. And then Tony, one of the co-founders, and I, we turned it into a cut and then we printed it on clear acrylic. And so now when I hold it up to the light and shine a light on it, I can project my shadow all over it. So I'm not really like a physically creative person. So this whole experience was pretty revelatory for me, And I was so intimidated at first, but then I discovered that it's super easy and it's super fun. So you might think the achievement here is getting this machine on a desktop, right? Like you no longer need a forklift truck. And that is very true, it's really cool. Or maybe that it's now less than half as expensive. That is also pretty cool. But from a software and user experience perspective, here's something that I think is really, really cool. Because that old laser printer, or CNC cutter, not only is it large and expensive and terrifying, but to make it cut in the right place, you have to position the material very carefully and do a very detailed calibration process. But Glowforge users won't need to do that. Probably many of them will never know that that's how it used to be, because the challenges of positioning have disappeared and now it's all done with image recognition. So I want to talk about showing decisions rather than data, which again is like a very abstract phrase, but it's okay, I have concrete examples. So I think weather's really the canonical example of this, right? Because how many of us have ever seen a meteorological report? Now we all have. This makes no sense to me. Because with weather, we care about the conclusion, right? Like, what outfit should I wear? Or, what is a good day for that hike? That's kind of a more Denver question, right? And so we look at something like this that gives us conclusions, not the data it's based on. And then another common example here is traffic. So I have a smartwatch, and it tells me when I need to leave, or it tries, it's not really accurate. It always assumes that I'm driving, and if I'm actually going to be on time, it only tells me after I've left. But it's really getting there. And the interim step to that was being able to have a traffic view. So if you look at the subtle color coding on the map, it shows where the traffic is with the red and the orange and the green. This is a really subtle visualization of a lot of data. So I think these two are kind of like boring and predictable, really. Like, we all knew they were coming, we all used them a lot. But what should I do, I find, is a more interesting question. And does anybody here use Foursquare? A couple of people. So this is the problem with Foursquare, right? Because they're evaluated like they're building digital crack, because it's considered to be a social network. But they were actually trying to drive behavior or dollars in the real world. If I use Foursquare and I take 5 people there with me, that behavior is not captured in the app, but it does make a big difference to wherever it is we went. I found my favorite tea place in Medellin on Foursquare, and now I go there several times a week, and that's a significant behavior change. So Foursquare really tries to help me make decisions. It tells me where people go after the art gallery I was just in. It tells me where people go who like the things that I like. It is the app that I use that comes closest to making decisions for me. But my usage doesn't demonstrate addiction, because it's not digital crack. But it does drive more dollars in the real world than anything else I use. The UI has always been a compromise. Programmers thought the terminal was fine, and humans wanted other humans. And the UI was this thing in the middle. It was a hack that really pleased no one, because other humans found it so foreign, and programmers have generally despised building it. And so now we see the rise of Slack as a platform, and the increasing popularity of chat-based interaction, and this idea that no UI is the new UI, which is so great for accessibility. So with Slack, I think about going where people are, right? This is why bots and integration are really interesting, because they come to where you are, and you don't have to add some other digital place to visit. The interaction comes to you, and the behavior change seems very minimal. But then bots are actually super effective at causing significant behavior change. So who uses Slack? Everyone uses Slack, right? And who has seen the bot that corrects you when you say guys? I used to have long conversations with this bot about problems with hiring. It would be like, don't say guys. I'd be like, Slack bot, it's all guys, but don't worry, I have a plan. This is what I'm going to do. And it never responded to me. But, we had it at Ride, and I saw it changing people's behavior. They didn't have to seek out this awareness of Ride, of language. It came to where they were. And now we have like our new Slack, and we actually don't have that Slack bot setting in there. But I see I never see people using guides because their behavior was trained before. It's okay. It's like, when you're speaking and you speak into this ominous silence, it's nice to know that you're alive. So speaking human, I think again is about meeting the user where they are, but this time in terms of language. And I think when we talk about language and how we use it badly in our UIs, we often talk about error messages, right? Because they're the worst culprit of inflicting text speak on humans. And we give people this terrible experience, right? This terrifying experience, because something has gone wrong, and we've told them it's something that they have no way of understanding. But more subtly, I think we fall down on this when we focus on what the user does rather than what the user achieves. Like Cate Sierra talks about this. She talks about making users badass. And isn't that, that's what I want to be doing. But I think really what this means with your users is that you don't ask them to learn anything because you're communicating with them in a way that they already know. And this is not just human language, but a conceptual language. It's dragging an image over your material and pressing print, rather than having to figure out an opaque calibration system. Human communication is only around 7% vocal content. Some of it's vocal elements, but 55% is nonverbal. So body language, tone, these are all clues to our real meaning. And Digitally, we have the interaction, but we also, especially on mobile, have other things that we might know, like location, calendar, social media. And these are all signals of what's going on with the user. And when we can use them, it's really transformative of the UX, or really evil, like Uber's use of battery life, right? But when the product appears to learn and get better based on this data, it requires less and less interaction because the conclusions from the data have got better and better. So here's the thing. User experience has been the bridge that we built between the way that machines operate and how humans do. It's how we've allowed humans to create and manipulate data digitally. But really, it's kind of been a hack. And this is why movies always have talking humanoid robots. Because that was the dream. A computer wasn't a computer, it was a cool sidekick with a superpower, machine intelligence and computational power. And we're really not there yet, right? And anything that begins to look like that dream has typically been so much of a crushing disappointment that it just makes it seem like we're further away. But putting together this talk, I actually started to feel optimistic, which is obviously rare for me because I'm British. Because I was like, maybe we are making progress on this. It looks different and it's so gradual that until I took the time to think about it, I didn't really notice. Because the experiences we've seen in the movies have always been so ostentatious and shiny. But real progress sometimes looks like nothing at all. Or perhaps what progress often looks like is a series of failures. So I just lost 8 months of my life to a product that failed. I didn't lose it, I have so much to show for it. I have a bunch of friends, I have so much that I learned, and yo hablo mucho más español. But it has left me thinking a lot about failure and about types of failure. Failing to be invisible means that your product is annoying, and if your product annoys people, they won't use it. And if people don't use your product will die. And I'll tell you something that is important in human relationships, that is important if you're a team lead or a people manager, but it is also a lesson for us in terms of what we build. You don't get to fix people. You only get to enable them. I think this is really core. Like if you're building something to fix people, you're doing it wrong. Because we're not building Hermione or even Harry, the ultimate sidekick. We're building the invisibility cape. We're building the Maruda's map. Or we should be, because if we're not, we're probably going to fail. And our success when we build tools is not time and app. It's actual human effectiveness. And the success of our notifications is not in their app open rate, but in them telling a user everything she needs to know so that she doesn't need to open the app at all. And if you start talking about what the user should do, rather than what the user wants to achieve, then you failed them. I carry around a device in my pocket, and using it, I can run an engineering team, I can write, I can create art, I can manage my finances, I can learn a language, and I can be in constant contact with my friends. I can't code on it, but that's like the only thing. Everything else I do, I can do on it. And I love my phone not because it entertains me, but because it enables me. And sometimes I worry that we have spent so much time lauding digital crack and celebrating hackers and rock stars and 10x engineers, which, by the way, they don't exist, that we've forgotten who our users are because we've been centering ourselves instead. So don't ask who your user is, ask what they want to achieve. Because the alternative is product failure. So like I said, I've been thinking a lot about failure, and I realized that I have written a lot of code in my career, but very little of it is still in production, because most of the things that I've worked on have failed. But generally, engineering has been the least of the reason for the failure. And I think that's because the low-hanging fruit is kind of gone, and mainly we're left with minor inconveniences and behavior change. And nothing remains offline only. So we're kind of left with things to optimize, or we need to invent new things that people didn't realize they needed yet. And behavior change is really hard. How many things can you think about that have really driven behavior change? Pokemon Go has got people to walk around outside. Like, that is extraordinary, right? But say, like, Kim Kardashian has an incredibly popular app. Is that really behavior change? Or is it just a different outlet for an existing behavior of celebrity obsession? So if we accept that sometimes the best user experience is no user experience at all, it brings us back to optimizing. Because when you're trying to optimize, you kind of need to disappear. And there are a lot of apps that, are trying to better facilitate minor inconveniences, and all they offer is a different digital kind of minor inconvenience. And these applications invariably fail. I don't believe that Uber would have succeeded if they had started outside of San Francisco, because outside of San Francisco, taxis were kind of a minor inconvenience. But in San Francisco, taxis were so terrible that they were able to create something significantly better. And now the experience is mostly better than most cities. And this is helped by the fact that so many taxis are liable to be cash only still. But I don't think it was at first. So when I was thinking about failure, I started thinking about kind of three big different reasons for failure. And so one is organizational failure. The organization is too dysfunctional to execute. Product failure. People will not use the product that has been built. And engineering failure. The system fails. And I would say that being invisible is so hard that you cannot succeed in becoming invisible if you're failing on any one of these dimensions. So I picked, it was very hard to choose, but I picked one lesson from each of these kinds of failure. So organizational failure, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that organizational dysfunction bleeds downwards. And as that happens, communication becomes harder, and hard periods either bring people together, sometimes in a new dysfunctional way, or drive them apart. And then you start to see things that arise between the difference between the what and the how. And you see this when the right, or at least very necessary decision is enacted in such a way that nobody believes in it and nobody buys into it. Or when you give or receive feedback that really needs to be heard, but in such a way that it never will be. To me, this is the difference between the what and the how. And, if you do the how bad enough, you can make the what irrelevant. Engineering failure has normally been focusing on the wrong time frame of execution. Either letting short-term hacks pile up so that eventually everything grinds to a halt, or over-engineering for a future that never arrives. I still have nightmares about the time when I found myself building a platform when we were supposed to be building a product, and how when I kind of tried to suggest that this was not maybe the best idea, people seemed to get really angry about it. And then a year later, when all 3 people messaged me to be like, hey Kate, you called it. I'm like, that's cool. If you had listened to me a year ago, And finally, product failure. Often trying to build things that fix users and give them what they should want rather than what they actually do. Being annoying instead of invisible. So there is a rhetoric in tech that claims something much grander and more dramatic than what I've been talking about today. We talk about changing the world. We love to talk about changing the world. It is mostly not true. Even working at companies that genuinely have changed the world, most of the day-to-day work of an engineer will not come close to that kind of impact. Their careers will be littered with failed features, failed products, even as this overhaul behemoth moves forward. And this isn't clear from the outside, because whilst products are launched with a fanfare, they're killed quietly. It is surprisingly easy to eliminate months or years of work. I would know. So my biggest lesson on failure is that we build with bits, not bricks. And sometimes, actually quite often, I think, all we leave with is what we've learned and our relationships with each other. Better make them good.